Hello and welcome back to the Ghoul Guide Association, the show where we talk about all things the Gothic and pop culture. We are, as ever, your Ghoul Guides. I am Lauren.
And I'm Mary.
And today we are joined by a very special guest who is here to talk to us about a topic that we are both particularly excited about, and it has a really nice interconnection with Mary's work. So we are delighted to introduce you, our lovely association members, to Rehman Abdulrehman, who is a clinical and consulting psychologist and writer. And his work explores the deep intersections of culture, identity, and social justice. And here to talk to us about his brand new novel, A Jinn in the Family, which Mary has finished and I am partway through. And I can say so far that it is an absolute delight.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad you like it.
It is a fabulous, wonderful book, and hopefully by the end of this episode, if you haven't read it before, then all of our lovely listeners will go out and buy it and read it, because it is a fantastic read. So thank you, Rehman, for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
We will get to your book in a minute, but I think just to start us off, I think some of our audience will be familiar with Jinn. Some might not know anything about them, and some might only have heard of the name. So I wondered if we could start with just a kind of short summary of what we mean by Jinn.
Yeah, absolutely. Most people are probably familiar with the term genie, which is right. Everybody knows about Aladdin and the lamp, and that's really pulled into popular culture. But genie is actually a mispronunciation of the Arabic word jinni, and jinni is a singular, powerful jinn. Usually, and we'll talk a little bit later about this, a specific type of jinn, usually known as an ifrit. And so the jinn are what most people would consider in the Western world spirits, but in the Arab and the Middle Eastern world, in the Muslim world, they're actually a whole other entity. So whereas in the Western world we attribute many supernatural experiences to ghosts, which is like the spirits of humans past, Muslims don't believe that. They believe that there were three entities created, or three types of entities created. And the first were angels made out of a pure light. And then there was the jinn and different versions of them created out of a smokeless fire. And then there was humankind created out of earth, or carbon-based life forms. And animals are supposed to be considered as a part of that carbon-based life form. And so the cosmology of the jinn surrounds this concept of faith, and it's tied into the story of creation for Muslims. So Muslims don't believe, for example, that the devil was a fallen angel. We believe he was a jinn, and not the first jinn, not the original jinn, but a very pious jinn who was in heaven and had the sin of pride when Adam was created. There's actually, interestingly enough, a lot of neuroanatomy built into this story. But when Adam was created, he was praised for his free will, or particularly his frontal cortex, which is why when Muslims pray, they put that part of their body to the ground. And so the devil, who was a jinn, Iblis, said, how should I, one who's made out of a smokeless fire, bow to one who is made out of dirt? And so on the story begins. So that's the story behind the jinn.
Fantastic. Yeah, I feel like it's something that Western culture, as it does with so many things, has really appropriated certain aspects and elements. We have, particularly here in Britain, the tradition of like pantomime, and the genie has appeared and does appear in so many aspects as this very comical, very camp figure. And then you have not necessarily part of Western culture, of course, because it's of Japanese origin, but you have things like Final Fantasy, which then, takes its cues from things like Dungeons and Dragons, that uses particularly the figure of Ifrit as some kind of, exotic fire monster, and it crops up in things like True Blood, there's a whole episode that I've kind of looked at and talked a bit about before, is like a war trauma aspect, and
Yeah.
it seems like one of those aspects where a single idea and a single part of something very rich has just been taken and dropped into a completely different and completely kind of unrelated, maybe even fictional realm. And I do feel like there is that real disconnect for a lot of us as Western audiences of not realizing where this actually comes from, which I
Yeah.
think is something that your book really beautifully kind of challenges that for a Western reader.
Thank you. Yeah, that was one of the big reasons to write the book. I mean, there was many reasons, but one of it was to tell a tale and to tell a story truly from the cosmology and the culture that it came from,
Mm-hmm.
in the nuanced way that it tells it. And you're right, like the jinn do show up in different ways. I think the closest I've seen that gets close to is American Gods. There's like a jinn,
Yeah.
and it's like it gets close, so it's like it's interesting because like those of us come from different cultures, we get a little bit excited when we see elements of our ethos and our folklore show up, but it's
Mm-hmm.
never really done the true justice, right? It's always kind of westernized from an
Yeah.
misunderstood perspective. And I was like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore. Like I really, I got to tell the story the way it's supposed to be told.
Yeah,
Uh,
I feel like it's very simplified, and
yeah,
that, that's very much the take. It's kind of, I don't like to say dumbed down necessarily, but a lot of the nuances has taken out of it. Um, and I know that happens a lot, particularly with the horror and gothic kind of spaces. But
tough.
yeah, it's I think it can also be a really delightful experience to read something and be able to just fully immerse yourself in that knowledge and um, in that story, and to be able to engage in that way with. And I guess it's the cultural appreciation aspect of it all, to be able to.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of literature, and particularly something like the Gothic.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I find that we do have room. It's interesting in Western storytelling, including in Western horror. We do have room, and we've created space for the nuance. I think about Mike Flanagan and the Haunting of Hill House, and like you see the nuance of horror, and he does a really good job of integrating cultural pieces, particularly Midnight Mass. I thought he did a beautiful job, but there's nuance. We think about vampires and things like that. They're not. We've had that opportunity to have that nuanced storytelling when it comes to Western mythology and Western folklore, and so much so that it's almost like it's given its own sense of legitimacy, right? Like it's okay in the West to believe in ghosts, but if you believe in jinn, it's a different thing altogether. And so I think it takes time. Like I think the world is really hungry for, like, I mean, how many times
Mhm.
can we tell the same stories over and over again? And I think culture and identity is a different way to pull in
Yeah.
different storytelling.
I always have that moment of, why is it always a Catholic priest?
Yes,
If we
it's true.
live in this multicultural world, why are we always calling on why is every quote unquote evil spirit afraid of holy water blessed by a Catholic priest?
It is
And I
true.
like, yeah, I
Yeah.
kind of, I like the way that some of the Gothic and horror started to challenge that recently.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that storytelling element is really important as well. These aren't always written down stories, and the way that they're told and passed on, it does have that ability to change and adapt and also reflect different kind of cultures. And I
Yeah.
think I really liked how you described that in your book, that the Jinn, like people, came in different tribes and cultures and faiths.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that your book is a really kind of really interesting focus on your own personal knowledge of Jinn stories in Zanzibar and Dar el Salaam. And we, like I said, we will get into that a bit later. But before we do, could you talk a little bit about that kind of cultural evolution of Jinn and
Yeah.
how different traditions have emerged and developed across islands like Zanzibar and in Africa, but also Turkey, Iran, India, and maybe like, are there elements of cross pollination between those stories, or specific aspects that are unique to certain places and certain cultures.
Wholeheartedly. Well, like a lot of my work has been done in culture, and the thing is, culture changes. Like, we have this view of culture like it's like this singular thing, and it's like, I'm going to be cross-culturally competent, and I'm going to learn about people as they are now in this particular state, how they are in foreign countries, not how they are here, right? And because we don't understand that culture is fluid and it changes and it travels. And one of the things that travels is stories. And so, you think about, and the concept of the jinn predates Islam, right? So, like, the Quran, for example, does commentary on the jinn. Like, there's actually a whole chapter in the Quran called Surat al-Jinn. Like, it's like, here's like the religious understanding that you should know of the jinn. And for Muslims, they have to, we believe in the unseen, but that also requires, God is unseen. So how do you believe in the unseen like God and not believe in certain concepts like the jinn? And so there's the commentary on it, and we get like a backstory. But the backstory is that the jinn predated like humankind, and they predated Islam. And so this idea of, and that's why, I talk about in my book, as this does in many Muslim and Middle Eastern cultures and African cultures, that the jinn come in different tribes. They come in different cultures and different faiths. And actually, it was interesting. There's actually a story, according to Islam, where the Prophet Muhammad actually went to preach, like to speak, to read the Quran to the jinn. Like, he went, yeah. And so the story was that the Prophet Muhammad wasn't just sent for humans; he was sent for humans and jinn kind. And so there's actually a mosque in Saudi Arabia that's called Masjid al-Jinn, and it's built over top the area where the Prophet actually went to go preach to the jinn, to read the Quran. And so you'll hear in my story, that there's like a jinn character who says, and when he remembers, hundreds and years ago where he heard the Prophet say this, and so this idea of conversion does happen within the jinn, allegedly.
Mm-hmm.
But that also means that the source of knowledge for the jinn is not just religious. And so one of the things that I found very interesting is, so, like, I'm a self-described nerd when it comes to the jinn. I have read, like, since I was a teen, I'm 50 now, so I have read every single theological book about the jinn. Every single one. I was like, I could find it in English. I read it. I was like, my thing. And then, like, it wasn't until I was like a grown-up that I started to visit Dar es Salaam. Now, I heard a lot of stories about the jinn this and the jinn that. They didn't really fit my knowledge of what I had theologically. And I kind of discounted it. And then you go back to places, where your family comes from, and you hear stories that are not tied to faith, but tied to culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no description of that theologically. And that knowledge only comes from culture. And that's passed down from person to person through experiences, through folklore. And a lot of it is, interestingly, like, it feels real, right? Like, you're like, I don't know how else to explain that other than that cultural knowledge. And so, the cosmology of the jinn has like that dual fold aspect. Now, interestingly enough, if you don't mind if I go on,
Please do.
So the story of the jinn it doesn't exist on its own. It's always interwoven with humanity and the concept of magic. So now, according to Islam, the concept of magic, and I talk about it in the book or allude to it, is in current days typically seen as a form of something that's haram or Islamically not allowed, illegal, or discouraged, where you engage in what, in Arabic is called sihr. And you see this word show up in different, in the same way that culture travels, this word shows up in different parts of the world in different languages, right? So sihr, everybody calls it. Now, this concept of magic is typically seen as one that you can only engage in magic if you engage the help of the jinn. But even according to Islam, the concept of magic or hidden knowledge existed long ago. So there's this story of two angels that come down to Babylon. And and they teach mankind of the quote unquote hidden knowledge and magic, and it results in the development of these grimoires that now exist and get lost, in time. And there's no knowledge of this in Christian tradition, but according to the Jewish tradition, so in Islam we call them Harut and Marut, and in the Jewish tradition they're called Shemhazai and Azael. And so there is religious folklore that talks about it, and now you see them mixing together. It's like, well, what was that hidden knowledge? And so to me, the supernatural and the jinn are two distinct things, and then they intersect. And then comes in folklore, and then what's real and what's not real. Who's a charlatan? What do you talk about it, right? And I'm not sure if you caught it, but at the beginning, the book talks about, the Quran talks about a verse where there's 19 senses, and there's 19 angels, each standing over the hellfire, each one representing, a sense of the human being. Now we have our 5 senses. And so, when we think about the supernatural and human, and, a lot of people who claim to have extrasensory perception and all of these other things, where do they fall? And then I also put that into the book where there's 19 chapters, so one representing each sense kind of thing. So anyhow, so that's the cosmology of it. It comes from both faith and it comes from culture. And I find the combination of that to be absolutely fascinating.
I think, yeah, that's really interesting. The idea how important nuance is, and that kind of the unperceivable, the unseen. You have that with the description of Jinn as the smokeless fire, and it makes me think of John Milton's Paradise Lost and his concept of darkness visible.
Yes.
I mean, Paradise Lost, I think, is Bible fan fiction. It's hilarious, but I think darkness visible is something that's so interesting because it's so hard to imagine, and it's the same with Jinn, both kind of physically, but then also how that relates to what you've been talking about in terms of culture and folklore and theology and existence and our own perception.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Particularly when we think about the importance of religion and culture and that cross connection in terms of how religion shapes cultures and how cultures shape religion.
Absolutely.
We develop religious practices to either help us better understand the world, to help us shape our cultures, to bring us together. That idea of hidden knowledge is something that exists in, you go back to the Sumerian traditions, or it's quite a big thing in Gnosticism, this idea that there's this knowledge, and obviously you've got things like the Adam and Eve story, this knowledge that humans may or may not be capable of having, and what's the consequences and the possibilities of that. Is it going to corrupt us? Is it going to help us ascend? And I think sometimes when we take the culture away from the religion, we, like Mary said, and you said, lose that nuance to then be able to apply it to our lives and how we choose to live and how we make decisions. And, I think for me, even as an atheist person, I can look at that and think, well, that helps me better understand how I make ethical and moral decisions, because, how do I exist in the wider scope of things? And I think thinking about a tradition and a kind of creature like the jinn, and that idea that there is the divine, the human, and then something else, I think it really helps us visualize that. I think that's something that that your book does really well as well, is help us visualize that idea. I think it's a hard concept to kind of put together, and I guess, like you said, you had the theology and then you got the culture, and I can now really see how those two things are blended together and how you've kind of made those interconnections really work, which I know is something that Mary really loves, because this is the thing that same thing. Mary will find a little strand and then go down the rabbit hole, particularly in like Jewish folklore and cosmology, and then kind of come back up to the surface and be like, right, this is it.
It is. Yeah. It's interesting because I find that like even within faith groups, I find we've moved our understanding of even something like faith to be so material, right? It's interesting because the concept of faith is meant to be spiritual, and then we take these things and then we put them aside. And I think about things like the Spanish Inquisition and all this knowledge that existed, in Moorish Spain, and the burning of books, and I'm like, what have we lost? right? Like, what have we lost, and what are we choosing to put aside because we get so stuck in our views of what can and can't exist? I think horror really allows us to challenge some of that, and I think storytelling allows us to challenge some of that, and I think it yeah, and I think storytelling can be a way to evoke a translation of knowledge in a more effective way.
Yeah, I read a couple of years ago a really beautiful novel by G. Willow Wilson, which is about the fall of, like, the final days of the Moorish kingdom in Spain, and it's
Yeah.
about a young girl and a young boy trying to escape the Inquisition, and it's a sort of magical realism, knowledge discovery, similar, kind of ideas. And the thing that really stood out to me about it was that when we have that separation, we often lose the knowledge because we we go too far away from it. And she explored that really beautifully, that idea of, like, well, what did we lose by making that really hard line,
Yeah.
and what do we lose of knowledge? I mean, I, I'm a bit of a TikTok junkie, and the amount of times that I'll see TikToks that are like, oh, did you know that the reason this superstition or the reason this old wives' tale exists is because of X?
Yeah.
It is that idea that we've sometimes come too far away from the heart of that story or the point of that story. The thing that always makes me really mad is, like, people that think Atlantis is real.
Alright.
It would be great, but
Yeah.
you're also missing the really, really valuable lesson that was trying to tell you. And I think sometimes we do that as well with that materialization of faith and
Right.
of storytelling. And that I think, yeah, horror and Gothic is just such a good conduit for that.
It is, and what I wanted to do with Jinn, or Jinn and the Family, and what I love about stories that do this is that they don't make it so fantastical that it becomes that you watch the movie, you read the book, and then you put it back on the shelf, or you stop and you leave the theater. I want it to be something that you kind of second guess and you carry with you, right? I mean, to me, that's like, to be haunted by a story. Like, that's the thing that I would like. It's like, wait a
That's the
second,
goal.
that's the goal, right? Like, I've seen movies that I think about, like, they haunt me for, like, weeks after I'm still thinking about them, or reading a book, and I'm like, I mean, to have an idea carried with you. I mean, to me, that's the goal. But I think to achieve it, I think is really delving into true horror that kind of, like, skates this balance between, what's real and what's not. And if we go so fantastically over to the other side, it's almost like, we are lost. It's just like, what? I don't know. Does that, like, look at the Epstein files? Like, that's true horror, so fantastical, and everyone's like, what do you want for lunch?
Yeah.
It's just so much that it carries no meaning. Anyhow.
That's such a good point. I mean, not to I mean, our listeners will mark on their bingo card Lauren mentions Anne Radcliffe, but that's Radcliffe's whole thing about terror and horror, is that terror is a force that enlightens the mind. So acknowledging or exploring the idea of something like Jinn, or letting yourself kind of ask those questions or consider forbidden, letting yourself go to that level or face those terrors, is
Mhm.
something that can expand and it can enlighten, and it is terrifying, but it is transformative.
It
And
is.
she defines horror as something that freezes you in place, that is
Yeah.
so horrifying that you can't move on from it. And obviously modern horror very much does a blend of the two things, and you have terror and horror as a kind of combined force. But for
Right.
Radcliffe in the late 18th century, during, the first ever global war where there were people dying left, right, and center and atrocities being committed, for her, horror is this inconceivable thing that kind of, like, stops you in your tracks and your brain can't move past it. And I always think, for a modern perspective, it's almost like the cognitive dissonance of horror, of you open your phone in the morning and you see the 8 new things that have been revealed for the Epstein files, but you
Yeah.
still have to commute to work, and you still have to answer your emails, and you still have to do all of these things. You can't be frozen in place because you don't have the luxury of being frozen in place. You have to continue on. And that kind of, like, that cognitive dissonance is something that I think we're all really struggling with at the moment, and that more terror, less horror might be a good thing. But yeah, I think that's such a good point, that we're all living in a state of kind of perpetual horror, but horror that we just have to put at the back of our minds. And if something can stay with us and follow us and help us think, maybe even readdress the way that we think and feel and act, that's a really powerful, beautiful thing.
I agree.
Speaking of true horror, I think some people, maybe who are familiar with Jinn to an extent, might have a kind of idea of Jinn as being, non-human and therefore evil. But I think in your book, you draw this out really beautifully, the idea that Jinn are like human, complex. They can be kind or cunning, good or evil. And according to Islam, many humans were also shaitan because they embodied traits typically associated with evil. And talking about Epstein and lots of human atrocities that have been committed across history that are, evil. So I think, how do you think that we should kind of think about Jinn in these moralistic terms? Are there good or bad Jinn? Or is that maybe something that, maybe that's the wrong way to think about it? Maybe, again, we need to bring in more nuance to how we conceive of Jinn.
Yeah, I think it's the nuance of not knowing which Jinn people encounter that makes it kind of truly like horrifying, right? You're just like, is this a good one or is it a bad one? Are you just mischievous? Do you mean we unwell? But also yeah, so yes, like the Jinn can be good or evil, but they're like human beings that can have different natures, different temperaments. Islam generally recommends to stay away because you don't know, right? It's just like cut it off, clean, don't engage. But culture is a bit different, right? And then there's some answers I think that we can't really answer. It's like, what do you do with? And we talk about magic. What do you do with people who are sensitive to? What happens to people who haven't actively engaged but are passive, participants with? What do we do with stories like that? And that's where things get very interesting. And the book has characters where they're like, these people haven't sought it out, but they are, certainly followed by, have some sense of inheritance of the Jinn. What do you do with that? And I think that's where you get these interesting kind of stories to tell. One of the things that talking about Epstein, but also in the book, there's a revolution, right? The book partially takes place in the Zanzibar Revolution. And I think what I'd hoped to achieve in that is to really question what and who we consider to be frightening and horrific, and that sometimes the real monsters aren't the supernatural. And in this case, like, it was the story flips it all on its head. The true monsters are people, and it's actually the supernatural that are the heroes, right? And so yes, we become unsettled by the supernatural at first, but then and it's like people who we think are bad are sometimes good, and who we think are good are actually bad. And this idea to be mindful about that, and not become complacent, that automatically these labels automatically get assumed on people, and then in fiction, paranormal beings, and those labels govern how we choose to engage and behave with people. And that's yeah.
I think that part of the book was really powerful, and it was horrific, but not because of the Jinn, but because of the acts that were being committed by humans. And I think that's really important for all of us to remember, that humans can be monsters, and it's not, humans good, supernatural entities bad, but we need to kind of think about the nuances and the complexities and everything like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the most it's not ill-informed, but it's not the best informed representation. But I mentioned this to you just before we started recording. I did some work on a particular episode of the American show True Blood, where a Jinn, I think it's supposed to be an Ifrit. It's this kind of like fire spirit, essentially follows these soldiers who essentially committed an absolute atrocity. I think it's supposed to be during the Iraq War, and it's this idea it's not the most well executed, but what they're trying to do is engage with that idea that the true horrors of the contemporary age, particularly warfare, is the things that humans do to each other, but also particularly the things that people that consider themselves to be good people, particularly in this case, soldiers, which is something, that a lot of my work looks at. This idea that a soldier starts out as a good, honest, righteous person, and under greed of command, whatever it might be, kind of commits terrible acts. And that is something that I think we've started to kind of come back round to in the terms of the kind of Gothic. Mary and I often call it a mutant snowball. It rolls through the decades and it picks up more meanings and things as it goes along. But the same, in the late 18th century, women were using the Gothic as a way to communicate their fears about wartime and revolution. And the whole thing about the Radcliffean Gothic is you have nothing to be afraid of from the supernatural, but you should be afraid of that man who acts like a polite gentleman because you have no protection. And you should be afraid of these things and you should be cautious of these things. And that during a time of war and instability and uncertainty, that was, where the Gothic found its footing. And that as we've moved through the decades and, for better or worse, we've become global in terms of our media, that we've been able to use the Gothic as a way to explore our anxieties about these, so-called unprecedented but very much precedented times.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting that you're able to kind of, it's almost like a universal language, I think, the Gothic tradition. It's something that we find all over the world, but it also allows us to talk to each other and it allows us to communicate stories in a way that is familiar, but also invites someone into a different culture or into a different knowledge, and in a way that we can communicate with each other. And I think that's one of the kind of really beautiful things that Jinn and the Family really picks up on, is that within this tradition, we can continue that tradition of oral storytelling and sharing the knowledge that otherwise we would lose.
Yes. And the Gothic nature of it, right? Like metaphorically speaking, of history and trauma and, and that eerie element. And that was the thing, is like, usually when we think about Gothic, we're thinking about Western stories.
Yeah.
And, I was thinking about it. I'm like, what do I call this? I mean, this is really a Gothic novel, if I were to think about it, right? But it doesn't take place in Europe, Is it Arabian Gothic? Is it Muslim Gothic? It ultimately was Zanzibar Gothic, because Zanzibar, it's so localized. I mean, these stories are reflective of different places as well too, but Zanzibar was such a, and I say was because I think Zanzibar was almost a time more than a place, at least culturally, right?
It may, in a weird way, because it's very different circumstances, but it might just be because I've recently been reading a lot of this for some work, but it made me think a little bit of the Haitian Revolution.
Yeah.
Because often for worse rather than for better, unfortunately, but the Gothic became really, really important in the Haitian Revolution as a way to communicate backwards and forwards.
Yes.
And as in a way that the French Revolution didn't really have, but I've seen kind of in fiction in the last kind of 20, 30 years coming out of places like Syria or the Lebanon, like Haitian Revolution Gothic in that early 19th century really showcased that anxiety between, I really believe that what we're doing is the right thing, but are we doing it right? And is there a right? Where does the means outweigh the cause? That sort of, that real anxiety around revolution of this needs to happen. And you see this in a lot of Latin American Gothic, particularly kind of Cuban and Mexican, this needs to happen, but at what cost, and what is the right way to do this? And kind of how do we proceed with this?
Yes, absolutely. Wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
And Zanzibar has that mixture, right? I mean, it was,
Yeah.
it was a Sultanate of Oman, and we'd say colony, right? But then a culture and a people develop as a result of it. And then the British show up, and then, there's that colonial influence. And it's just like, okay, well, now who do we blame?
Mm-hmm.
And and that's exactly what happens is, you split the people,
Yeah.
and you sustain the power. And I mean, that shows up in here in more than one metaphor, right? Whether it's the direct issue of the people that are being discussed or the supernatural elements that are being discussed, be it, the senses of the characters or the actual characters of the jinn themselves.
Yeah, well, it's kind of sticking to literature on that point.
Yeah.
The stereotype or the convention of the genie in the lamp, we talked
Yeah.
a little bit about pantomime,
Yeah.
that emerges in the Western tradition came, kind of prior to the Gothic in that early 18th century.
Yeah.
So 1001 Arabian Nights, or the Arabian Nights, was first published in somewhere between 1706 and 1721.
Yeah.
And Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp found particular kind of purchase with particularly English readership.
Yes.
And this is a period of time where Orientalism and Orientalization was huge, particularly in the literary tradition in England.
Yeah.
And I do say England specifically because we're we're right on that cusp, for one thing, of the Act of Union, but also because not that there ever is a homogenous culture, but there really wasn't at that time.
Yeah.
But in the book, you talk about the assimilation that you experienced in Canada as being like a fight, where, and I'm quoting, "It was like trying to keep our culture alive in the fight against Canadian assimilation." And I wondered if you wanted to expand on that a little bit
Yeah.
here in relation to wider assimilation of jinn stories.
Well, it's interesting when we talk about the assimilation piece. It's like the battle is not just with the culture outside, but the culture within, and this multi-generational trauma. Like, I mean, I got to tell you, like, one of my favorite pieces of clothing is a nice, well-cut English suit. Like a nice wool suit. I love it. I absolutely love it. But then I realized, like, looking back, I have this photograph of my my late grandfather, and it's his wedding photo, and he's in a tuxedo, like a little bow tie, cleanly shaved, except for this little thin little mustache, which was classic to British fashion for men at the time. And it only occurred to me, like, after he died, I'm like, why wasn't he in traditional wear? Like, this is not what men wore in Zanzibar. So why is he wearing that? Well, he grew up poor, ended up getting a job with the British, and he couldn't get education, but he was self-taught, got to work in this department with the British, and as a sense had adopted this culture as a sign of, like, upward mobility. And it goes to show that really horrifying things is our identities don't just come from majority cultures, they come from people with power. And so there was this minority British rule, but they had power, so they influenced him. And then you look at the sultans over the time, what they originally wore, and then the later sultans were dressed like the Brits, right? So, like, it's not just about power and privilege; it's a sense of authority. And then so I'm like, okay, wait, did I get it from him? And then I think about my father, who always said, a well-dressed man always had a button-down shirt and khakis, right, with good shoes. I'm like, that's very British. That's not very African. That's very Zanzibari. And I'm like, I've internalized that, and I don't know how to get rid of that, right? Like, and so the challenge of assimilation is never just one between the person and the outside culture of where they are, but really about the back and forth. And like this book, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to, like, elaborate more than you need, but the book is like, the characters are very similar. Like, yes, it's a psychologist. Yes, it's about a culture I'm from. So it's informed by me and informed by my family, but isn't me, right?
Yeah.
And the fiction gives me the liberty to be able to tell stories that I think so many people relate to. And this is a story that everyone relates to, right? And I was like, and I thought I would be, and, like, I'm a psychologist, I'm a cross-cultural psychologist. I know that people relate to this story, but it always amazes me who relates to it and how much, right? Like, I have a connection with the tribal king of Hawaii, and he read my book, and he wrote this nice little thing, and he's like, I totally relate to this. Like, the unseen spirits, we're not allowed this in Hawaii. We fight this colonization, and the colonization is not just tied to, and again, this concept of assimilation. He's like, we live in Hawaii, but we were colonized, and now we're fighting assimilation from our own culture in our own country. And so this relatability for me is common, and the jinn for me are not just, it's not just a horror story. it's a metaphor, right? Because the Jinn and Jinn stories are a metaphor for culture and identity, that we show up in the West, or the West comes to us, and then we have to put this stuff away, right?
Yeah.
Don't wear that clothing, don't talk that language, put away that stories, that's backwards, it doesn't make any sense, so we push it away, and it only shows up around people that we trust. We have a dinner table and people tell stories, and that's when they show up in quiet, when we feel safe. And to me, that's the challenge, right? It's just that it's an ongoing battle, and the Jinn is that metaphor for me, at least in this novel, in addition to it being an actual Jinn story. So
no, and I think you're right about the fact that it is so, in so many ways, so universally relatable, not only because the Canadian tradition in terms of literature has always been really confused about what its identity is. Margaret Atwood was talking about this in the 80s, like, what does it mean to be Canadian? And like, what do we do with this history? And how do we make sense of this? And what is our identity? And I was thinking about this, I think it was a really kind of serendipitous timing that I started reading your book at the same time that the Super Bowl was happening. And you've got this whole discourse about, Bad Bunny singing in Spanish. Well, he's a Puerto Rican citizen, which is a semi-unrecognized colony, but also Spanish was spoken widely in America before English was spoken, but then you have that added complexity of that was still the colonizing language. There's such a tension, and this is one of the things that I particularly love about South American Gothic, and that I think a lot of writers really kind of pick up on. And I think this is where you get that cross-culture appreciation in terms of, this is such a relatable story of how do you navigate that reality, and how do you be part of a modern world and have this identity, but also look back, and how do you be both colonizer and colonized? And I think that was kind of coming through as well, particularly with the idea of Zanzibar and its really complex colonial history. And I think this is a really relatable story. I think people all around the world will be able to read this and find something that they understand. And Ricky Martin sang a Bunny song, which is essentially a song from Puerto Rico to Hawaii, saying, we're really sorry that happened to you. We hope that doesn't happen. Like, you're our sibling. We're two completely different cultures, but we're in the same situation. We understand each other and we appreciate each other, despite the fact that in so many ways we're completely different. We are the same, and we have the same pain and the same experience.
Absolutely.
Okay, so kind of still on that note, let's talk about Zanzibar Gothic, because I think that is a really good way to term it, and how Jinn relate to the Gothic. We were kind of wondering if you could expand a little bit on your concept of Zanzibar Gothic and how it relates to the tradition or the mode of the Gothic, and sort of how you interpret the figure of the Jinn in relation to the Gothic, and the ideas of colonialism and revolution and generational trauma or resilience that we pass on through that idea of storytelling and kind of memory and inheritance.
And the interesting, so the to me, the frightening story is not just about the Jinn, right? As we've spoken about, it's about the entire context of what's happened and how it continuously perpetuates in the site. As you said, it's this idea of colonialism, of repression, of revolution, and then whether that makes sense, and then the eerie concept within it, and history and this richness. To me, if we've already loosened the term of what Gothic means, now it needs to incorporate a different cultural lens, and it can't just come from the European context. And so that to me was really what I meant by Zanzibar Gothic, and I mean, I created these little reels for the book, and it does feel very Gothic, right? Like, I mean, if you tie the images together, that's exactly what you'd want. It's just not white people. It's not, it's like, and I think people of color have struggled to really find their place in horror. It's interesting because, like, people of color tend to face some of the most horrifying experiences due to racism and colonialism, and yet we're not the ones telling the stories. And so I was like, I got to tell this story for so many reasons, right? I'm like, the story has to be told. I co-authored a book called Movies, Miniseries, and Multiculturalism, and myself and some colleagues basically go through movies in different genres and talk about, what we learn about culture and identity and social justice through these movies. And I got to tell you, working on like horror and fantasy, it's like slim pickings, right? And when you do find it, it's just not done well.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where, that's where it's like, I need to label this what it actually is and give credence and value to the country that developed it. And lo and behold, I came up with the term Zanzibar Gothic.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. And I think
Thank you.
one of the big things that 21st century Gothic has been doing is trying to flip the script.
Mm-hmm.
And it is becoming more mainstream, but and maybe this is because that, the Gothic has always been a level of subculture, but it's trying to, a lot of that early Gothic posits the outsider as the monster.
Yes.
The vampire of uncertain origins from the West Indies is
Yes.
who can pass as white is the colonial horror. Even, Dracula, like all through the 19th century, we have this intense anxiety about in the Western Gothic, oh, well, we've colonized, but you don't get to be part of, you're the colony, you don't get to be a part of this. And how do we navigate that? And I think as we've moved into the 21st century, and in the same way that goth subculture has gone, okay, well, I want to self-identify with the other. I want to positively self-identify with the other. It gives that power to flip the script and to reject that colonial narrative.
Yeah.
And there's obviously still work to be done. We only have to look at what's going on, not only in the US right now, unfortunately, but, across the Western world. We only have to look at that kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back that seems to be the constant of our age. But there is power in art, and there is particular power in fiction,
100%.
that I think it's a really powerful thing to do at this point in time. And like you said, it's a story that needs to be told.
It is. Yeah.
And I think, there's a real power in that kind of like transaction of knowledge.
Yeah.
I work in research culture, and we talk about knowledge exchange all the time, and it's a very, research culture, it's one of those terms that gets thrown around, but there is genuinely something so valuable but often so overlooked about that exchange and about how we take that knowledge and move forwards.
It is. So, I mean, so psychology, we call it knowledge translation, right? But even as psychologists, we tend to be incredibly elitist about how the knowledge that we have, it's like it sits in these ivory towers of these journals that, we just kind of self-congratulate on, and they get published and then that's it. And it's like, well, how does that trickle down to everyday people? Like, how do we benefit from this information? And it's interesting because like I was a writer like in my 20s, but it was like it's kind of like coming around in full circles. Like, okay, now we've got to use all of this to translate, to filter down. Like, let's not just use jargon. Let's talk about ways in which we can have these conversations and this information is released. And if the only way we talk about the jinn or Muslims or Arabs or any cultural group and their folklore is through like misinterpreted, appropriated stories, that's a real disadvantage. One of the things that I like to do, and if you don't mind, one of the things I'd like to talk about is how, like, even within, like, this book is very psychological. As a psychologist, I'm just like, and it shows up as problems that we have even as psychologists working with people and how we choose to label and quote unquote diagnose people. And I talk about like, there's certain things in the book that are actual real events. Those things did occur. I don't say which is which because I like the guessing game, but I will say there's a couple of stories where I've worked with patients here, that are my patients, and they talk about experiences that are very supernatural. But if they saw anybody else who wouldn't have believed them or had the cultural, they would have instantly moved, been considered to have some form of psychosis, and what that does for treatment is actually very dangerous for somebody who doesn't have psychosis, right? I remember a young man I saw who was from a northern reserve came in for something completely different, but when his trust said to me, when he was young, and actually how it continued to happen on a regular basis, he would have like things fly around the kitchen, and him and his siblings would have to hide under the bed as the cabinet doors would open and close violently. It was like, well, what do we do with that information? He doesn't meet any other criteria for psychosis. He's fully lucid. He came in for an anxiety disorder, which was legitimate and fair. What do we do with this information? And this happens culturally for people all the time. Is like, how do we take those experiences, give them credibility and have meaning, or rather than impose our colonial view and language on that, right? And yes, there is a commonality of mental health, that it's not a colonial thing to consider health. That's a separate issue. But within health and within labels, what do we do with that? Yeah.
I think that's really powerful, because I think sometimes there is this way to view the world through the lens of either religion and spirituality or science, as if science and the secular world has all the answers. And I think, as someone who is also an atheist, I think it's important to understand how much of that is bound up in the unknown. Like, yeah. I don't know. And I think that's important to understand. And in science, so much of what is known is based around disproving things. And what we know today is based on what we've disproved. And we, I think, need to be humble and acknowledge that we can't know everything, and we don't know, and we can't describe or define or characterize or classify everyone's experiences. Won't necessarily fit into neat little, scientific or secular packages. And we need that language of culture or of Gothic, where there is that nuance and that kind of in between that allows that.
We also tend to assume that science and secular science is unbiased, and the reality is that it's not.
Agreed.
And so much of it comes from either eugenics, from Christian morals, because a lot of it is Western science. And we in the last 10 years, we've really seen how ignoring Chinese medicine, traditional Latin American medicine, like in a lot of the scholarship out of the Islamic world, in ignoring that and in making these cultural assumptions, but also enforcing healthcare and a certain type of social care onto cultures, how it just doesn't work and actually can cause mass distrust. It can cause huge issues. It's that idea that, I talk to my students about this a lot. I'm like, just because it seems like it's rational doesn't mean it's unbiased and doesn't mean it's right. You have to take a step back and you have to think, why do I think this way? Where have I got this from? And how is this going to be impacted? How does this impact people? And 100%. I think, like there's just something about that assumption that science and by extension medicine is unbiased when it's really, really not.
It's true. Now, but the interesting thing is, I think that what we don't recognize is the inherent assumption that science is inherently Western and white. And then we weaponize science, to belittle and disparage, different ways of knowing and understanding, not understanding that most of science came from Eastern philosophies and traditions, right? The same people that gave us, algebra, and modern medicine were the same people who believed in jinn. Like that is a fact, right? And both were possible. They had a hard science that we all benefit from today, but they also believed in the supernatural.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, one of the things that always makes me rage is when you get people saying like, oh, the pyramids in Mexico were built by aliens because they couldn't possibly have had the technology. No, they had science. They just also had this system of belief.
Yes.
One does not kind of cancel out or counteract the other. You can have both, and it is that way of like, what is science and how, and even today, if it's not published in English, does it get the gold star?
Yeah, wholeheartedly.
I won't go down the research tangent.
Yeah.
Conversation for another time.
I'm trying to suppress my academic rage. Like, let's put it. I'm not going to complain about academia. Not in this talk. No, I won't. I won't do that.
No, we can. We'll separate podcast episode will be the rage against the academic machine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Talking about academic rage, and also what we were talking about earlier in terms of the ivory tower and trying to speak about these topics and these subjects and share these stories in a way that actually will impact people. I think that popular media is really important and it is really valuable, as well as just in general, like sharing stories, whether it be a story from your family or reading stories with your children or going and engaging in fiction. So we've talked a lot about Gothic and mentioned horror, but I did just want to briefly talk about horror films because they are something that I really, really love. And it seems like you also really love films and horror films as well. And I think aside from maybe Aladdin and Disney, which we will put to one side, but I think people might have come across Jinn in terms of horror films. So I wondered if you had any perspectives on the kind of horror film landscape as it comes to Jinn horror or those kind of, or I guess maybe Muslim horror we can talk about more broadly as well, because I know there are lots of really great Muslim-led horror films out there, but a lot of Jinn horror is from that westernized storytelling where it's a Western kind of director, writer telling a story that's not necessarily theirs to tell.
Yes.
So yeah.
Well, you know what, when I work with like patients of mine who come from communities of color, different cultures in the diaspora, I would say you can't run from the West. And the truth is that we export the West everywhere. We see it everywhere. And, you'll go to different parts of the world and you'll see the West caricaturized in some ways. Anywhere you go, you'll see some caricature version. People say that's what the West is supposed to be. And people try to live up to that version of what the West is. And I think that the storytelling when it comes to the Jinn has kind of fallen prey to that as well. Not always, but you see this kind of dichotomy of good versus evil. All the Jinn are bad. They're meant to possess. In some ways it's like Poltergeist or, The Exorcist all over again, in a different people, same kind of story. I mean, there are some good ones. I mean, don't get me wrong. I was like, there's some Turkish series about the Jinn that are completely horrifying and I love. But it's interesting that one of my favorites was 3,000 Years of Longing. Have you seen that movie?
Yes. Yeah.
I haven't seen it because I can't watch horror, but
it's soft.
I know it.
It's super soft, right? It's like it's not really horror so much as it's a Jinn story, and it's beautiful, it's nuanced, it's gorgeous. It was written by a white British woman, who, and the thing that makes it beautiful is that she goes to tell the story of Solomon, which is a Muslim story, and Sheba, right, which is a Muslim story. These are stories told in the Quran. And so, and the main character is a white woman who finds a genie, right? So it's just like, it's not only is appropriated by, you're going to take that culture and you make the heroine, and there's really important lessons about racism and, bigotry that show up as well too in that movie. And I love that movie. Don't get me wrong, but it wasn't told or written by a person from that culture. And so, so they are there, but they still view it from this dichotomous lens of black versus white. And I think we need to, and that's actually not a culturally accurate view. And so I think we've got to move. I think there's a lot more room for that. I keep pushing my friends who are filmmakers to go, you need to make movies like this. And here's a book. So hint, hint. but I think that there's a lot more room for that. And when it was done well, there might be like for example, American Gods, it was white people learning about these other traditions and pulling it together and doing a beautiful job of it, but again, still a form of appropriation.
Yeah. Feels very not that it's that long ago, but that's like a very 2010s, like when we had The Help, 12 Years a Slave, like we had all of this media
Yes.
that was very like hand holding white people into being less racist, which it's not like it's not something that was needed. There
Yeah,
definitely was media that was needed to cross that bridge and to force that, that empathy
for sure.
and broaden that empathetic lens.
Yeah.
But we're past that now. Like that's not the media in the literature that we need.
No, it is.
And I think, yeah, you make a really, really good point there that we've done that and
Yeah.
it doesn't need to keep happening. We
No.
need these stories and we need the perspective. We don't need more of that conversation where it's like, is this appreciation or appropriation?
Yeah.
We need that sincerity and that.
And you can never have
that
too many
sharing.
movies. Any one person who makes a Jinn film, like, will be a completely different story to someone making a different Jinn film, because it's so I think we get this from your book. It's so like personal and cultural, and there isn't a monolith.
No.
There's so much variety, and I think we need more movies to explore all the kind of the flavors of Jinn.
Yeah, you said that at the beginning about like culture not being, a monolith, and I was thinking like, oh man, in the Gothic we always have this debate, and it's a really tied debate about homogenous versus heterogeneous, and the reality is that nothing is a homogenous monolith, and we really need to move away from treating things like that. I've got quite a lot of students at the moment who are working in projects, and they're having, I admire them for it. They're having such a tough time convincing, the senior academics or the leadership in sort of like hospitals, community centers, things like that, that we need to move away from this and we need to change our opinion. And I think you don't realize how deeply, deeply rooted that idea that there is, this is how British Asian people feel, and this is how British African people feel, and this is how working class white British people feel. There is no one overarching narrative, and we need to stop thinking in those terms because it clearly isn't working for us.
100%.
Because we're still having to have these conversations.
Well, it's because we dichotomize people and we dichotomize culture. We recognize, we don't understand the concept of intersectionality. We don't understand the concept of like, of how people grow and how culture grows and how it transitions, right? Like, and I mean, it's why I chose to keep Zanzibar as the forefront. It's weird because the more I think about it, it's like Jinn and the Family is very much like the fiction version of my academic work, right? I'm just like, how did this, like, okay, I guess I'm one person that showed up that way, but I mean, it's why I chose the book Zanzibar. In some ways, like in a very personal and selfish way, like I wanted to stamp like in culture, in pop culture, like my people, and like, and it's interesting because I consider myself Canadian, but like my history has been erased, right? Like it doesn't exist. And we watch what's happening in the world and stories and people are kind of disappearing. And I'm like, I need to put down somewhere a record of some form, right? Even if it's fiction with some semblance of truth, who Zanzibaris were. Yeah. Right. And that was very important for me.
Isn't that such a powerful example, though, of this, not to bring it back to academia, but this conversation that we're all having globally in academia at the moment about STEM and about the lack of funding for the humanities and the lack of appreciation for true interdisciplinary work, and that, we're currently trying to make up for lost time by, getting PhD students to look at film as well as policy and to actually go, oh, well, maybe we should look at the art that people make about these things as a way of adding to our academic knowledge. And I think you summed it up really great there, that you have your cultural self and then you have your academic self, and you've blended them together in fiction. And that's accessible. That's something that has posterity, that will, it's available online. You can get it at a bookshop. You can read it. You can have, your reader, your like, what are they called? Screen reader read it to you. Like, it's such an accessible form of knowledge. It's one of the oldest ones we have.
Storytelling, right? I have to tell you, I'm very excited. It's going to end up back in Dar es Salaam, actually, in one of my favorite.
Amazing.
There. Yeah, it's hopefully going to be there sometime this week. But like, it was sentimentally important for me for Habit to show up in the place where the story began, right? And so, hoping it gets there soon.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah,
that is really amazing. And actually, that's a really nice segue into our kind of like last section. We've talked about your book a lot all the way through because it is so fantastic. But I think, reading it is such a personal and poetic novel. So I guess, what is it that made you write this story?
I started writing this in my early 20s, and I wanted it to be like a fictional homage to some of the matriarchs in the family. But over time, I ended up rewriting most of it, right? And it was like, as I was approaching 50, I was like, okay, it's time. Like, I wanted to come back to things that brought me more joy than my academic work. And it was this artistic work that just really filled my soul.
Yeah.
But as I said, I really wanted, there's so many reasons, storytelling, to make sure that we challenge certain concepts, to talk about culture and identity. And it's part of a larger project, which we can talk about at the end. But very personally, I wanted to be on record. There's very little told. There's 9 novelists from Zanzibar that are known, 4 or 5 of which who are now dead. There's not many of us. And so it was really critical and important for me to kind of to put a stamp somewhere, in the, history of culture that tells a little bit about who we were as a people. And that was really, really important to me. And it was important for my son, I wanted him to, he wanted to be in the book. He's in, I'm like, well, I'm not going to put you literally in the book, but elements of you in there. Mm-hmm. He's like, can I be in the book? And I was like, okay, we'll come up with a character for you. So, so he's in there, but it was important for me to just have it there because I will be honest, I'll get really personal for a second. It's interesting because the book talks about these migration periods that happen in our family. And it's migration after migration after migration. And the heart of most of these migrations were really, really racism and colonialism. And it's interesting, we're watching that happen in the world all over again. Yeah. And it wasn't long, I feared the same thing here in Canada. People think about Canada being a stable country, but, we had a prime minister here who was very Islamophobic, incredibly Islamophobic. And, he went on national television, national news saying, the threat to Canada and the Western world is, quote unquote, Islamicism. That's not even a word. And wanted to engage our national security, our national police force in developing a tip line for neighbors to report on their neighbors if their neighbors engaged in, quote unquote, barbaric cultural practices, which was, engaging in the practice of Islam. That's Nazi Germany right there. Right.
I was just going to say, at the moment, I'm doing a lot of work around the Holocaust, and you can't not see parallels with that, even just that kind of neighborly surveillance and knowing where it leads.
It's and I remember watering my hydrangeas in the backyard, and this guy was gaining power. It was a complete sideline that a different prime minister won, who had his own issues separately, but I was like, I don't know that I can live in Canada. That was I've never had to think that. I grew up here. I came here when I was 7. I've never had to consider relocating for safety. And as this movement was gaining traction, I was like, I really need to consider over the next few years where else I can live. And it's this story, though it's fiction, is very real. This issue of safety and migration shows up in people all over the world, and it is a common story today.
Yeah.
And that is probably more horrifying than any ghost or jinn story I have ever heard.
Yeah.
This concept of displacement.
Yeah, I think that really resonates with the UK at the moment, unfortunately, and that is truly horrifying. And I think it's one of the horrors of growing up. I think you grow up thinking that and I, as I say, I'm partway through, but I started to get this from the novel that that idea that you grow up feeling like you're in a multicultural community and that that you live in this progressive world, and then you grow up and you realize that
That's
not
not
only
true.
isn't true, but it's on like a knife edge,
It is.
and that it could and may well tip at any time. I think that's the kind of horror of that maturing into becoming a conscious political adult. And I think we use the Gothic to not only explore that and communicate that to one another, but also to rally together. It's also quite a powerful way of reaching out across those different cultures and communities and like holding hands and saying, I'm with you, like I see you, you see me, we're together on this. In a way that I think, there's music that does this, but I think the Gothic has a really unique ability to empower in that way, despite the fact it does have its own very, very troubled colonial and often very racist past, and still does get used. We can't pretend like horror and Gothic fiction and film doesn't get produced every year. That still is very conservative, but it does have that transcendent power to also be the thing that connects us in the face of those horrors against one another, which I don't know, is that too deep of a note to end on,
No,
Mary?
very not to me.
No. Well, I think then we will wrap up there. Our final question: what's next for you, and where can people find you?
Yeah, absolutely. I've really cut down on social media and where I'm at. So I'm predominantly on Instagram at Dr.R.Abdulrehman, ABDULREHMAN, and I'm on LinkedIn with the same name and handle. What's next? So as I mentioned, like Jinn and the Family is really part of a larger project, and it's Lead with Diversity Press. And so what we know is that over 80% of published authors in Canada and the US are white. And that leaves less than 20% for the rest of us. And when we are published, our work tends to not be showcased or celebrated. If it does, it tends to promote, this sense of tokenism.
Yeah.
So, and I've been published academically. I have 2 other books that exist with another publisher. Thankfully, they're very kind and supportive of this work, because that's what I talk about academically. But I was like, the rest of us don't have this, and so our team started Lead with Diversity Press, which publishes literature and works of authors of color. And so last year we published Teapot, or the poetry of, we've censored the word T for terrorist, and it's the poetry of angry Black or brown people. We've published 41 authors of color who are poets, and there's beautiful, rich poetry in there. What we'll be doing this year, we'll be working on an anthology of short fiction, of horror, fantasy, and science fiction, tying together those genres with racism. So the working title is Monster, horror, fantasy, and the fear of racism. That'll be coming out hopefully by the end of the year. And I'll let you guys know when we have a call for submissions.
Please do. We'll share it. That sounds fantastic.
And then I'm working on a sequel for Jinn and the Family. That's currently, the working title is No Such Thing as Ghosts. So
excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been such an enlightening conversation for us. We're really, really honored to have had you. For our dear association members, our listeners and viewers, there'll be links in the show notes and the descriptions. And you can obviously find Rehman on Instagram. I know a lot of you follow us on there anyway, so you can go and have a look. And if you have any questions, obviously you can always pop them over to us and we'll send them on to you if that's okay.
Can I give you a little bit of trivia tidbit to close things off?
Yes, that's a great way to close.
Yeah. So remember I told you that the jinn come in different types. There's like different variations. A ghoul or ghul is actually an Arabic word for a very particular kind of jinn who is a trickster and a shapeshifter and lives in graveyards. So you've got a personal connection with this Arabic cosmology.
That is fantastic.
I ghouls are another thing that I'm really interested in, and I know that they're connected, but that behind me are my supernatural cutouts, and there are jinn and ghouls in there, and I always think that it's really cool that our kind of idea of ghouls is linked to this this Arabic concept of ghouls or this specific type of jinn that hangs out in graveyards. So thank you so much. That was maybe we should do that as another episode, exploring
that would be great. The
ghouls.
origins
But
of
yes, thank you so much for that. For that bit of trivia, for this conversation today, and for your book as well. Really, really fabulous.
It's been fantastic.
So much obliged.
And to everybody listening, as ever, stay safe and stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky.